Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 228 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Each week on the podcast, we have leadership conversations to help us lead better in the spirit of Jesus' unhurried way, the way of leadership that flows from a full soul instead of an empty one. Sometimes I'm talking with fellow authors, and sometimes I'm talking with leaders just like you, who are learning to live and lead at the fruitful pace of grace and peace. Today, I'm sharing a recent conversation with Trevor Hudson, author of Seeking God. In it, he shares wisdom he gained in a long mentoring friendship with Dallas Willard and long practice in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. He talks about the reality of how the life of the kingdom of God is a different sort of life. It's a life that meets us even in our places of hardship or weariness or pain. I think you're going to find a lot of grace in what Trevor has to share. Trevor Hudson has been part of the Methodist movement in Southern Africa for more than 35 years. Serving primarily around Johannesburg, South Africa, he is deeply committed to the work and ministry of the local congregation. And a significant part of his weekly work is the giving of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Besides his local commitments, Trevor travels widely, preaching, teaching, and lecturing in the areas of spiritual formation, spiritual direction, and pastoral therapy. He lectures at Fuller Seminary, Pasadena, in their Doctor of Ministry program in spiritual direction, and he also works closely with the Renovari International Institute for Christian Spiritual Formation and the Dallas Willard Center for Christian Spiritual Formation. He's the author of 22 books, including Seeking God, which we'll be talking about today. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, would you please follow, rate, and review? And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Trevor Hudson. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Trevor Hudson, author of Seeking God. Trevor, thanks so much for making time for this conversation.
Alan, it's a real joy to be with you and to those who are listening in.
Thank you. Well, I've been looking forward to it. I sure enjoyed reading your book, Seeking God. And I wonder if, as we begin, if you could just tell a little of the story of how that book sort of came to be.
Yes, thank you, Alan. I really need to say thank you to Debbie. Debbie's the woman I'm married to. She said to me, this must have been about 6 years ago. She said to me, Trevor, I know what the title of what the theme of your next book needs to be about, and I was rather intrigued by that. And she said, I think it's going to be about seeking, and ever since I've known you've been a seeker. So I need to say thank you to her for planting the seed of seeking in terms of maybe a book, and that's, I think that was the beginning moment.
Sounds like good spiritual direction. I know I gain from my wife, Jim. She's often got the best eye and ear for what I perhaps need to see and hear.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly in debt to Debbie. I really am.
Well, so throughout the book, and even in your subtitle, you mentioned this. You draw on two important teachers in your life. You mentioned Dallas Willard, and you mentioned St. Ignatius of Loyola. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how these two teachers inspired you and maybe the connection you see between them.
Right. Thank you. It's both Ignatius and Dallas have been profoundly formative in my own my own walk with God. I met Dallas first of all through an audio cassette that I listened to in 1985. I took a chance, invited him to South Africa, and he came. And so that began a long friendship until his death, and through his words, but more especially through his presence and friendship. He modeled for me a seeking life, a life that really sought to be faithful to God, and that touched me very, very deeply. Ignatius, my encounter with Ignatius was in 1990 when I first did the spiritual exercises. I knew nothing about him. I was in a moment of vocational uncertainty and a time of one or two dreams shattering, and someone said to me, well, a lovely Anglican sister, Sister Maureen, she said to me, Trevor, you need to do the exercises of Saint Ignatius, and there's a monk down the road who does this kind of thing. Go knock on the door. And I trusted her discernment. I knew her quite well, so I knocked on the door of Father Andrew, a monk of the Community of the Resurrection. I asked him to take me through the exercises, and he kept muttering under his breath as we walked down the passage, I don't know what a high church Anglican like me is doing with a low church Methodist like you. and I think that was it kind of introduced me to almost the ecumenical spirit of Ignatius, that he kind of brings unlikely people together. And the exercises were really, again, just deeply, deeply formative. And that kind of opened me up to some of the treasures of the Ignatian world. And so Ignatius and Dallas, I would say, were two primary voices that continue just to shape my understanding of what it means to be a Christ follower. And what they have in common, I think definitely both of them were real God seekers in the best way I can use that term. I think both of them deeply, deeply Christ focused, profoundly so. Jesus really being central to both their lives. And then obviously the both of them, their own personal commitment to find a life-giving expression of discipleship to Christ in the world.
Yeah.
That kind of, that I think it was that I just had a sense, a kind of intuitive sense that they were saying similar things at different times of history, and also having a similar effect upon the worlds in which they respectively moved.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I really enjoyed reading and seeing you interact with your journey with Dallas in person, of course, and through his writings and such. But then your experience of the exercises and sort of your historical journey as it relates to Ignatius, but your present tense journey with those exercises. And I'm thinking some of our listeners are familiar with the spiritual exercises,
sure.
But some may not. I wonder, could you give us just a taste or a little bit of an overview of what the nature of those exercises are?
Well, thank you, Alan. They arose out of Ignatius's own reflection upon his own journey.
Yeah.
So and I find that really helpful. That they weren't kind of it wasn't a theoretical construct that he worked out in the office, but he reflected on his own journey, and as he reflected on his own journey and made notes of his own experience, this I guess we could call it this manual for discipleship, called the the exercises, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius emerged. And very simply, I would want to say that basically they have 4 movements within them. A first movement, kind of coming to terms with that I'm a loved sinner, a deeply beloved and bent human being. The second movement of coming to know and to love and to follow Christ. And the third movement, entering into his own death, his own passion and dying. And then the last movement of sharing in the joy of his resurrection. And the exercises themselves, constructed around these 4 movements, can be done in one of 2 ways, really. They can be done within a 30-day enclosed setting. They can be done, as it were, in daily life as well, when someone gives you the exercises. And perhaps the only disclaimer I need to give really is that the manual itself is not to be read. It's because right. it simply doesn't make sense that the exercises are to be done. They are given to us by someone who knows their dynamic and can offer them to us in a way that's helpful. And as Dallas would say, and Dallas saw the exercises himself, and he makes mention of this in The Divine Conspiracy, as perhaps one of the best curricula for Christ-likeness historically that there is for us, provided, and I think it's a helpful word, provided they are adapted suitably to our own context and to our own background. And Ignatius would certainly agree with that, with these very deep emphasis upon the principle of adaptation, of adapting the material to the unique particularities of the retreatant.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Well, I had the opportunity to be exposed some. I haven't engaged the exercises deeply, but I got a chance to sit under William Barry's preaching 15 years ago back there in Boston, and I enjoyed reading his foreword. It was bittersweet in knowing that he had passed somewhat recently. Can you share a little bit about your experience of the exercises as they're related to William Barry and his teaching, his writings?
Oh, thank you. Oh, a wonderful man, isn't he?
Yes.
Bill Barry, a Jesuit. And Bill, Bill, what he did for me was that he uses as his primary metaphor for our relationship with God, he uses the metaphor of friendship. And, that we're invited into a friendship with God. And so he puts the exercises within the context of developing and growing a friendship with God in Jesus Christ. And as you know, so much of his writings had this theme of friendship running through them. And I think the other thing that I really valued about Bill Barry, and I also had the real joy of going to Boston, and he led me through an 8-day retreat, I think the year before he died. Oh. And there was a homeliness about Bill, just a homeliness and a down-to-earthness that I just valued so much. And he kind of made Ignatius even more accessible to me. Yeah. Which I will always be deeply, deeply grateful for.
Yeah, I so enjoyed. He would preach. I didn't have him as my retreat director those 8 days, but he was the one preaching in the daily, Eucharist and such. And I just so loved his spirit. As you say, that metaphor of friendship had become really an important one for me. One of my mentors had really highlighted that phrase in John 15, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. Servants don't know what the master's doing. Friends do, is the implication. And that sense of being invited in is such a beautiful metaphor. So as you talk about at one point in the book, you talked about the phrase, the kingdom of God, and how that phrase doesn't always feel like a welcome
Sure.
or even maybe understandable phrase to some of those that you work with. But your way of talking about it was the opportunity to discover another kind of life. Can you say a little more about that?
Yes, Alan, I had to retire at the age of 65. I'm part of the Methodist family in Southern Africa. And so up till the age of 65, I spent my life really as a pastor. So my bottom line was always seeking to make things accessible, and particularly to make the good news of Jesus accessible to people. And as I share in the book, it was really through a relationship with the recovering alcoholic, John H. And just and I recount the story in the book, and I won't recount it here. But he had this lovely phrase, that when he was with people caught up in addiction, he would often say to them, "It really doesn't have to be this way." And that was a prompt for me in terms of the good news that Jesus really comes to us in the kind of mess and muddle of our life, and really does say to us, it doesn't have to be this way, and offers us in himself the possibilities of another kind of life. And so that phrase for me, another kind of life, has become a way of just explaining, the availability of the kingdom, and that the language of kingdom really, for most of the people that I rub shoulders with, would have, it's something that maybe is going to happen after you die, and it's really very far away, and it's in the future. But I think just something of saying that there is another kind of life available. And in the book, as you know, I seek to just tease out a little bit some of the strands of that life.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, and I like how that makes it present. I like the profound simplicity, I guess, of just a simple phrase like a different kind of life. It doesn't have to be, like this. That's so good.
Sure.
And as I was reading through, you shared a number of points at which Dallas would give you some particular piece of counsel that always sounded like it was probably timely and personal. And at one point, you shared something Dallas said to you, which is this: it's important that you tell the Lord very honestly what you want. And I just think some of our listeners, that would sort of be a surprising sentence to hear.
Right.
And I wonder if you could share what that's meant to you and how that might be an invitation for us.
I think well, first of all, let me just underscore what you're saying, that it did come with, Dallas had this wonderful way of saying things that kind of disrupted conventional ways of seeing the world or seeing your faith. So it was one of those disruptive moments. We were walking at the side of the lake, and, we were talking about, I think at that particular moment, our own futures and how long we would like to live, and etc. And he said, "Well, how long would you like to live? And have you ever spoken to God about that?" And I think what it did was that, first of all, it took me back into the Gospels, and just been really struck by Jesus's very first question in the gospel, when he turns to the disciples and says to them, "What do you want?" And so I think it was a question that introduced me at a new level to God's interest, personal interest in my life, and that God is really wanting to enter into conversation with me about some of the deepest longings, desires, and wants of my life. And that Dallas's question just opened up that big world of longing, of deep desire, and of our wants. And obviously, and I seek to make this clear, obviously there's also a dark side to all of that. But even if our wants are dark, if we bring them into conversation with God, there's a good chance that God's going to sort them out as we talk together. That was one of the many disruptive moments that I had with Dallas, when Dallas said, I think God is really interested in what you want, and maybe you need to begin to share that with God.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm remembering that in that 8-day retreat 15 years ago, my retreat director sent me away in one of those 24-hour windows with the question, which Ignatius makes so central, which is, what do you want?
Sure.
And my first thought was, that sounds like a dumb question. I flew across the country. I'm here. I want a retreat. What else do I want? But of course, I had 24 hours, and that only took 1 minute to react the way I did. And I remember I ended up writing something like 40 things I wanted.
Wow.
And some were embarrassing, and some were mundane, and but then some, when I saw that and looked back at them, I thought, oh my goodness, I think this feels like something from the center of who God made me. And I don't think we've leaned into a question like that. Sometimes we assume, who cares what we want? What God wants matters. And so I appreciate that. In a chapter you title, Exploring Life's Greatest Opportunity, you talk about 3 ways of understanding what discipleship to Jesus might look like. A couple of ways that maybe are less than ideal, and then maybe one way that really gets to the heart of what you believe Jesus is inviting us to. Can you unpack those a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Alan. And I have these little grids in my mind, and one of the grids is around these 3 ways, all beginning with I. And that for many people, and it's not a put down at all, but discipleship becomes mainly about information. And while I think information is really, really important, I think there are limitations around the transformative dimensions of information alone. And then I look at inspiration, and again, not wanting to in any way minimize inspiration. And I certainly wouldn't be talking to you if I had not had at least 1 or 2 inspirational moments along the way. But again, the limitations of inspiration alone to do deep inner transformative work within our lives. And then the third I, which obviously I lean towards very strongly, the I of being brought into an interactive relationship. And I think for me, the great gift of the exercises in particular is that they facilitate an interactive journey with Christ. And it's within this interaction with Christ that we give Christ that permission, maybe we could say, or open up our own life. Maybe it's through that interaction to His own grace that transforms us and touches us very deeply. So the word interaction has been very, very important to me, and especially when we hold it with that word "know" in the Bible. That when Paul says, for example, all I want is to know Christ, and he's saying this at the end of his life, not at the beginning. he's not saying, I want to know more, I want to have more information about Jesus, or I want to be inspired by him. He's really saying, I want to interact with him more intimately, more deeply, more personally, with his resurrection, with the cross in my own life. So
that's really
that
helpful.
word interaction is very big for me. Sorry for the sermon.
Well, I heard the sermon in the fact that the three words all started with I. You know, we preacher types were famous for doing things like this.
I know. You'll forgive me for that.
Well, of course. I do it too. And I love that. I mean, the interactive vision is very much a two-way. We're back to friendship. And there have been seasons where my relationship with God in an odd way was sort of one way. It was the things I was praying and the things I was doing for God and the things I was learning. And I thought it involved God, but it was sort of about God at a slight distance instead of that intimate, close, interactive friendship that you're describing. And I appreciate that. One of the gifts I think that Ignatius of Loyola has given to the church is the practice of imaginative prayer. I see it throughout his exercises. But again, that may be a practice for some of our listeners that is unfamiliar, or they may get a little nervous if you use the word imagination connected to prayer. Can you talk about how that might be an invitation to us?
Sure. Well, I think Ignatius had as a man of his own time and context and century, his own understanding of the human being and of faith was really whole life. That it involved all of us, and part of who we are is our wonderful capacity for imagination. Yeah. And so he does invite us to into what he would call imaginative contemplations of Christ in the gospel stories. And again, for me, I'm not someone who imagines things too visually. So it was a little bit difficult for me. I'm much more intuitive. But I think what he was inviting us to do, it was to enter into the gospel stories not only rationally or intellectually, but to really enter into gospel stories, to become a participant within them, not as an exercise in imagination, but as a way of allowing Christ to meet us. And I think I stumbled upon this long before Ignatius. I never grew up in a church. I didn't have kind of, Sunday school, but I was converted as a 16-year-old, outside of the church. And I just remember those early days of prayer when I would just imagine, before going to bed, I would imagine Christ with me. So I wasn't trying to create any reality. My faith said Christ is present, and I was simply putting my imagination at the service of my faith. And I would actually have a chair at the side of my bed, and I would imagine Christ with me, and I would share my heart with him. And so there was a sense in which my imagination was just helping me to enter into my faith a little bit more deeply and more personally.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think sometimes there are those who hear imagination and they imagine it's imaginary. And as you said, making something up, as opposed to using all of the capacities that God has given to me as a way of interacting with God. Sure. I love how you explained that. So I'm thinking of another chapter or a passage in your book. You talked about what many of us experience, which is seasons when God feels perhaps more absent to us than feels present. Of course, God hasn't changed, but our experience of God perhaps has changed. I wonder if you could talk to us, give us some guidance for navigating those times when we struggle to discern God with us.
Sure. I could I could say a lot about this, and I'm going to limit myself a bit. I think that, as you're saying, it's for me to accept, I guess, the ebb and flow of my walk with God, the ebb and flow of presence and absence, of high moments and low moments. And I think the one thing that Ignatius taught me, if I may bring him in at this point, is to really tell God everything. And that seems to be, 101, but when I'm with people and someone says to me, Trevor, I really do feel a bit distant from God, and I might say to them, how has it been for you telling God that you feel far from God at the moment? And they would look at me, and 90% of the folk would say, I haven't said that to God. And so there's a sense in which, so I think the temptation when I'm far from God is to give up engaging God. And I think something creative can happen when I say to God, I do feel forsaken. I feel abandoned by you. I really do. And to process that with God. And I'm not giving God information that God doesn't have, but it's not about information. I'm giving God access to my experience. And Dallas would often say, God's not pushy. God is not going to gate crash my life. But as I process dimensions of my experience with God, particularly experiences of absence and a sense of forsakenness, I think what I do is I give God a chance, as it were, putting it very in street terms. I give God a chance to allow God's grace more deeply into that experience of mine. And I'm just finding as I grow older that as I talk to God about things that sometimes, my angers, my resentment, my sense of distance, it doesn't solve everything, but things shift. There's a shift in my experience that I don't think would have happened had I not shared it.
Yeah.
I don't know if, Alan, I think my response has been inadequate, but
No, I think that's exactly right. It rings true for me. To me, I hear the language of John in his letter when he talks about walking in the light, which is to say, one way I think to hear that is to live the whole of my life in the light of God's presence. And as you said, there's nothing in me that God doesn't know.
Sure.
But there may be things in me that I don't know in relationship with God. I haven't entered into an interactive sort of, and I think some of us are timid. We think God's easily offended, or we think that God is easily overwhelmed.
Sure.
And in fact, God is not.
Sure. Thank you for that, Alan. I love the way you have phrased that. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you talk about, I think it's sort of the closing of the flow of the exercises that Ignatius invites us into contemplating the love of God. And you talked about a number of ways or facets of what that contemplation might look like. Can you talk a little bit about how we might enter into that kind of a contemplative exercise?
Right. The exercises have the spiritual exercises have a grand finale, really. And it's really, it's one of the most moving exercises, and I still do the exercise often. And it's really, and without over explaining, but it's really, it starts by acknowledging and savoring and recognizing God's love and goodness in every good gift that we experience. And that was a life changer for me. I think I sometimes had a bit of this is going back to 1990, a little bit of a split spirituality, that God was kind of confined in certain spiritual dimensions of my life, and not in the rest of my life. So he was maybe in my church service and etc., but not in the rest of my life. And I think what Ignatius does is, he says to me in effect, Trevor, what do you really enjoy in life? And can you discover in these wonderful things you enjoy, a cup of coffee, going for a run early in the morning, by the dam, will you recognize my goodness and love in these non-spiritual, gifts? And so that's how the exercise opens. And I won't go through, it has 4 steps, but right at the end, he takes it to a very moving place where he suggests that not only do we recognize God's goodness in these things, but in fact, God is pouring out God's self to us in these things as well, that they are and so that, the catchphrase of Ignatian spirituality, of really finding God in everything. Yeah. And really overcoming these unhelpful splits in our life with God. These things God's interested in, but these things God is not interested in. So it's really a contemplation of God's love, a recognition, a savoring of God's love in every good thing that we experience and know.
That's so good. And in the book, you do unpack that a little further and give us some guidance for how we might enter into that too. Well, as we come to a close of our conversation, I wonder if you'd be willing just to share a word of encouragement to our leaders, sort of in the spirit of a pastor, perhaps, rooted in the hopeful message of this book that you've written.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And I just want to think a little bit. I think the deepest encouragement I could offer myself and other pastors in leadership would be that we minister from a life. Yeah. From a life. We don't minister, as it were, from our heads, even necessarily from our words, although we do both, but essentially we minister from a life. Yeah. And it's as I seek God in my own life, and that seeking journey and that seeking and finding journey, which goes on forever, that I can only induct others into that life as I am living it myself. So my deepest encouragement would be to myself and to others would be seek and find God in every aspect of your life. Yeah. God is not playing hide and go seek with us. It's not that kind of, God's not being difficult with us, but God does lay stress on seeking. And somehow in our seeking, God seeks and finds us. Yeah. So I would just encourage, I guess, that we remain amateurs until we die, even though we might have a profession called ministry. I would want to be an amateur who is constantly seeking to be faithful to God. And that's what I would want to encourage.
That's wonderful. Well, we often talk about with our listeners that sometimes one of the greatest gifts we can give to those entrusted to our leadership is the spiritual growth of our own lives. Sure. And that the overflow of that, as you say, is the ministry that
Sure.
we offer. Yeah. Well, again, today our guest has been Trevor Hudson, and we've been talking about his book, Seeking God. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you, Trevor.
Alan, thank you that you have allowed me and given me access into your space. And I really, really want to say thank you to you and to everyone who has been part of this journey today.
Well, thank you. It's been encouraging to me, and I know it'll be encouraging to our listeners. When you get yourself a copy of this book, you'll notice that the foreword was written by William Barry, who was a member of the Jesuit order and an author of many books on spiritual direction that have been foundational for me. I had the opportunity to sit under his preaching on an 8-day silent retreat about 15 years ago. I was inspired by his profoundly simple devotion to Jesus. So again, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Trevor as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Stephen Macchia, Andrew Arndt, Matt Tebbe, and Ben Sternke. We'll also have episodes focusing on various themes related to unhurried living and unhurried leadership. I can't wait to share those with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.